And we're live. It is Tuesday, December 3rd, 2024, the year of our Lord. The sun is shining. The birds are chirping. It's going to be a great fucking day. And you are watching Dogshirt TV, which is a revolution in morning television. We are joined by the estimable Sarah Bond this morning, who is supposedly here, but I cannot see her. And if you will just give me a second, I will try to connect her. Give me just a second. And I'm not sure what is. We have never had a connection problem before, but I am not seeing the estimable Sarah Bond. Sarah, if you are there, can you say something in the chat? I have a feeling Sarah may be in the wrong in the wrong Riverside studio, but that's just a guess. Here we go. There is Sarah Bond. Sarah,
Hi.
it is so lovely to see your face
I
again.
know. It's lovely to see you guys. It's still dark here in Iowa.
Wow. Well, it is bright here, and I am sure the sun will be shining, the birds will be chirping, and it's going to be an amazing day in Iowa, too. Welcome to the successor show to In Lieu of Fun, which we call Dogshirt TV for, or maybe, I don't know what the word for shirt in Latin, but canis, there is no television word. I'm not sure how we would translate that in
I think you go with just tunica.
tunica canis. Excellent. Sarah, meet Ev. Ev, meet Sarah Bond.
Hi.
Hi, pleased to meet you.
So, what have you been up to the last few years? You seem to have written a book about ancient Roman labor practices.
Yes, I had a baby, so I'm very good at labor practices.
Congratulations. How old is the baby now?
Sasha is 16, almost 17 months, and then we have a 4-year-old. And so we had Wilkes at the beginning of the pandemic, and so she's a pandemic 2020 baby. And then we had Sasha, and in between the two of them, I started on a book on strikes because at the beginning of the pandemic, I became very interested in the fact that we have a new labor movement that is gripping America, and I'm not sure how the new regime is going to affect this labor movement. I think is going to try and stymie it, if I had to take a guess. But I was very heartened by the Amazon workers, the Starbucks workers, and the unionization that we haven't seen at these levels since the 1950s.
Yeah, so I am super interested in this subject. One of my children works in the new labor movement. But I'm really curious for Roman purposes. One of my kids is a labor movement activist, and the other one, as you may remember, is an amateur Roman historian. So if you put the two together, you get, like the cover of your book. But what counts as labor that can strike in ancient Rome? So you have these artisans, you don't yet have guilds. You also have a lot of slaves. What is who strikes in ancient Rome?
These are all great questions. So I want to say that the first strike that we know about is actually in a artisan camp called Deir el Medina in Egypt. So the first strike that we know of is around 1157 to 1155, so Ramesses III. And under Ramesses III, he is paying the.
So that's why we don't have any statues of Ramses III. Because, like, after Ramses II, they were like, Abu Simbel, this is it. God damn it. You're paying more. And so Ramses III doesn't get any statues.
He was not well loved by the workers at Deir el-Medina because he was supposed to be paying them in emmer and grains, and there is no coinage yet. There are other forms of payment, but money doesn't get invented, we think, until either China or Lydia. There is currently a debate over which ones invented coinage first, and that's not until around the end of the 7th century into the 6th century BCE. So these workers are being paid in rations, and they aren't being paid on time. And so they engage in, and we know this from a papyrus that survives from Egypt, which is how we have a lot of this evidence, is because Egypt is so arid that we have a number of papyri from antiquity in this area. And they engaged in something that in Greek, later on, we will call anachoresis, which is that you put down your worker tools and you go sit in the back of a temple and you just boycott. So collectively, these artisans decide that they are sick of being messed with by the Pharaoh, and they go and sit in the back of or just outside of a number of temples. And this became.
And just to be clear, when we say artisans here, we are, and Egypt, notwithstanding Jewish mythology, not a huge slave labor culture, right? It's people are wage labor in seasonal senses, as I recall.
Absolutely.
So,
when we think about the pyramids, one of the first things that I have to tell students is that a lot of people say, "Oh, well, the pyramids of Egypt were built by thousands of slaves," and the reality is that we think most of the pyramid labor that went into it was wage labor, and many of them are artisans that are living just outside of their work. You know, they live in artisan communities where you have clusters of carpenters, clusters of sculptors, and all of these people go into the making of these pyramids. But you're right, for the most part, we think that they're not a lot of enslaved people, that most of them are wage laborers like we have today.
when you imagine a ancient Egyptian labor action, is it these are roughly, it's much more comparable to a a modern labor action than, for example, something in the 19th century in an American plantation would be.
I think that we really have to discern between a rebellion and the withholding of labor with the intent to go back to work. So there's a chapter in the book all about Spartacus. And make no mistake, the rebellion under Spartacus was in order to get freedom and liberty. But the Deir el-Medina artisans, they're withholding their labor as a collective bargaining strategy in a way that we see boycotts, or right now the Canadian Post is on strike and they're going to go back to work. Okay. The Canadian Post workers are.
Not if Ev has anything to say about it, they won't. Ev's going to keep them out. She's, no mail in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, is that the Deir el-Medina people don't want to quit and escape completely. What they want to do is have a bargaining chip, just like all unions do, which is to say that they want improved environmental conditions, improved payment schedule. They want to get paid on time in their emmer and their grains, right? So they're hungry, and so they go on a boycott. But we can call strikes by so many different names because the term itself wasn't even coined until the 18th century. Like the first strike that we have that is called a strike is during the middle of the 18th century when sailors at the port of Sunderland in Britain decide to strike the topsails. And that's where the term actually comes from.
So it actually comes from hitting or ripping down the... Interesting.
Yeah.
I had no idea of
Well,
that.
so then the ships can't sail out of the harbor if the topsails have been struck. And so then the sailors that are along the Thames River near London, they also decide to strike the topsails. And so once you have two things in a row, you begin to have a number of these proto-unions within England striking, and then the term becomes much more regularized into the period of the Industrial Revolution. But just because the word strike isn't minted until the 18th century doesn't mean that we can't identify similar actions previously. And that has been the problem with labor history in general, is that you have to go through and find every single term in every single language. There's not going to be one word that you can follow from antiquity all the way to the modern day to show you that. And so it takes a fair amount of working together with other labor historians in order to say, hey, we need to call a rose by any other name, right? This is clearly the same action. And so we need to come together as labor historians and say, it's bullshit that we have separated these things out to say these are primitive people and these are advanced industrial revolution people, and to say that strikes are something that have occurred now for thousands of years. And so this book in part is to say, let's have comparative historians come together and really work together to show that collective action has been effective for thousands of years, that it hasn't just been an invention of Europeans from this period of the 18th century. So yeah, I love my Dear El Medina workers because they really go a long way towards proving the bullshit of the Industrial Revolution narrative, which is that great Europeans invented the Union.
There's the title of the episode, The Bullshit of the Industrial Revolution Narrative. I think we're going to run with that.
More mail. Just bring it.
Ev?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, I was wondering, this first strike, is it what gave you the idea of the book, or did you have the idea of the book and you started looking for, the first...
I've reread the Communist Manifesto, and this is doing nothing for the reputation of professors as being lefties, right? That I was sitting during the pandemic and reading the Communist Manifesto, but Marx and Engels are both obsessed with the secessions of the plebs. And the secession of the plebs to them is class warfare. And
Okay, so wait, for those who do not know the secession of the plebs, give us a little bit of a primer.
Sure. Let's talk about Roman attempts at withholding labor that are very important. And so we have to go back to this quasi-mythical, quasi-historical, because we aren't really sure from the stories that are written down about 400 years after the fact how true they are. But we know that a number of historians write about these two groups called the patricians and the plebeians. And Rome went through a monarchical period of 7 kings, from Romulus, who founds the city on April 21st, which is one of my favorite days. April 21st, 753 is when Rome is actually founded, mythically at least, according to legend. And then there are 7 kings of Rome, and then the last king is overthrown and sent into exile in 510. And then the republic, we call the Res Publica, it's founded in 509. But the thing about the Roman Republic is that not all men are ever created equal. And in fact, the patricians are the ones in power. The patricians have all of the magistrates, all of the senatorial power, all of the representation in many of the assemblies, and the plebeians, who are all those individuals who are not the original families of Rome. So everybody else who are not the patricians are all plebeians. They don't have as many rights as the patricians. So you can think of the patricians as like when you speak to your friends and they say things like, well, you know, my family came over on the Mayflower. And it is a pride of place that they have been in Rome since the early origins. And the patricians tend to be wealthy, but the plebeians also can be extremely wealthy. And so Marx and Engels, when they're looking at this struggle between patricians and plebeians, which we date to, it starts around 495 and goes all the way until 287 BCE. So it's about a 200-year struggle for the plebeians to get more representation and to get more rights. So we have these two groups that are fighting, but Marx and Engels thought that they were two classes, that the patricians are all a wealthy class in the modern understanding of it, and that plebeians are all poor. And the reality was that plebeians could be high status, they could be officers within the army, they could have a lot of money, just like we have very wealthy people today that may not have a lot of representation or status, but they still can have a lot of money. And so I got interested in rereading about the secessions of the plebs, and that is because in this 200-year period that we call the struggle of the orders, oftentimes they leave to go to various hills and spots outside of the city because the plebeians are the main labor pool for the military. And so they're withholding their labor from the military levy. And when you are doing that, when you boycott the military levy as a unit and together, you leave the city altogether, or you go to the hill like the Janiculum Hill, which is modern day Trastevere in Rome. When you're doing that, even if you don't have a formalized union, you are participating in premeditated collective action. So
right, it has all the we think of the and probably Marx and Engels contribute to this. We think of the secession of the plebs as a struggle for political power, and actually, maybe it's better thought of as a garden variety labor action.
I think they can be both because the plebeians within it come from different levels of society. So each one has a different interest in secession. So a lot of the first secession of the plebs, which we date to around 495 BCE, it is considered very much focused on debt bondage as an issue. And so one of the things before slavery grows to an incredible amount in the years that follow, before that, Romans could sell themselves into debt bondage as a form of debt servitude. And a lot of the farmers who are leaving their farms and going on military campaigns for the patricians, because the patricians keep on fighting various Italic groups that are in the Italian peninsula, they leave their farms, and so they aren't bringing in the crops. They aren't actually working their farms when they go on these military campaigns. And so they go into extensive amounts of debt, and then they have to sell themselves into debt bondage. And those debtors, when they come and they collect, people are very upset because they're like, I was serving Rome. How could I be taken into debt bondage after I am a veteran? And so really, these are veterans who are pissed off and they want to just stay on their farm and they don't want to go out on campaign anymore. And so I understand the plebeians that they're very upset that every time they want to just bring in the grain and bring in the crops, they're being told, oh no, we have another group that we need to fight and we're going to need you to serve in the military again. So
right, and of course this later in the Republic becomes a how to give these people land becomes one of the great animating creatures for conquest, that you've got all these people that you owe stuff to, and by the way, they might rebel if you don't, and so let's conquer Spain.
Exactly. I mean, you have to give veterans a lot of exit packages in order to ensure their loyalty to you as a general, especially in the late Republic. And Elon Musk, for instance, is absolutely obsessed with Sulla, which really is disturbing because Sulla is a dictator, and eventually Sulla does retire and give up power, and then Pompey and Crassus become consuls thereafter. But Sulla engages in prescriptions in order to get rid of his enemies, and
Right.
seeing Elon Musk's tweets about Sulla, he is someone who received a classical education when he was in South Africa from his emerald mining family, and he knows that Sulla killed the people that went against him, but also that Sulla settled his veterans and depended on them to rise up when he needed them.
But do you think that Elon Musk's affection for Sulla is deeper than just the tombstone line, no better friend, no worse enemy?
I think that the reason that he likes Sulla is that Sulla says that he is restoring the Republic, just like Augustus will later on. So he uses the rhetoric of freedom and
he's an anti, and he's, I mean, I really think of the Trumpist movement as more Marian than Sullen, right? They're interested in sort of populism there, but Marius loses and Sulla wins, and so they all want to be on Sulla's side. But really, the Sulla of our time, right? Somebody who is trying to restore the norms of the old republic is Joe Biden, but for the murder part.
Yes, I have to just say as an aside here that we have a wonderful person that lives here in Iowa who is an undersecretary of agriculture named Farah Ahmad. And Farah just left the Biden administration here before it turns over. And she has said to me many times, and I truly support her, that Biden is one of the most progressive presidents that we've ever had, and that he truly worked hard for the American people. And I got to say that I caucused for Elizabeth Warren when I was here in Iowa during the 2020 election. But I truly think that Biden, you're right, is a very progressive president. I don't always agree with him on all of his fronts, but I have come to see from people within the Biden administration exactly what you're saying. So.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean it from a policy point of view, because of course Sulla is quite retrograde, but like, if you think of like the Marius is right tearing stuff up in a very populist kind of way, and then Sulla comes in and tries to entrench the previous constitutional order. That's pretty Biden-Trump, except you have to imagine that then Marius rises up out of the grave and, eats the world.
I agree. Yeah. And I think that we can think about the forgiveness of debt in that whole plan as well. I think one of the biggest things Biden has done is I had $18,000 of my student debt wiped out. And as we know, under Trump, very few people actually got the debt forgiveness plan after 10 years of working in the public sector. And as soon as Biden became president, that program greatly improved, and thousands and thousands of people have had their debt forgiven for working in nonprofit sectors.
Super interesting. So, Ev, please jump in anytime. I'm just going to keep asking
Well,
questions
I
unless.
think we should talk now about the reaction from above going into the period of the late Republic and into the Empire, because one of the other issues today that I think is very important when we think about especially universities across the country is the freedom of assembly and how governments react to unionization or collective action through the rhetoric of revoking freedom of assembly because they're being treasonous or because they are a threat to X or a threat to Y. And Roman senatorial laws and consulta are very similar, as well as the reaction of emperors, is that when they feel threatened in any way by collective action, they revoke the freedom of assembly through the use of legislation.
All right, so let's talk about that. What is, broadly speaking, so first of all, sketch out for us what the broad arc of the history of labor actions in Rome looks like, and then talk about the reaction. What's how does uh, uh, um, Severus respond to wildcat strikes?
This is a very interesting progression that you see the laws of the 12 tables, which are Romans don't have a constitution like we have a constitution, that is to say, a set Bill of Rights and a set number of amendments. But the earliest laws that we have set down are called the laws of the 12 tables. And in 450 BCE, the plebeians win the right to assembly, which later on will be called something called the jus coeundi, the ability to come together. And so even if you don't have a lot of money, you can come together in bars, you can come together in households, etc. And around the 3rd century BCE, we see the flourishing of various groups across the Mediterranean that have lots of different names, but the one that is used in Latin the most is collegium. And this is where we get the word college from. A collegium in Latin is just a collective of 3 or more people. So by Roman law, if you have 3 or more people, you can form a collegium. But according to the laws of the 12 tables, you can form it if you do nothing that is illicita, nothing that is against the current laws of the Republic.
So this word collegium is like college in the sense of the electoral college, right? Not in the sense of like the University of Iowa.
No, this is more like a college, like the electoral college, and this is also a word that was used for the pontifical colleges in Rome, that is to say the priestly colleges. This is a group that is formulated for lots of different reasons. So we know of about 3,200 total associations across the Mediterranean from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE to about Charlemagne in 800. Okay, so, and that's just the ones we know from inscription and papyri. But you should think of these like clubs. You can think of them like groups like the Elks Club, for instance. You could think of them as just get-togethers. You could think of them as occupational groups, because we have carpenters that come together. We have textile workers. We have fullers. We have lots of metal workers that come together. So people form clubs and always have formed clubs for lots of different reasons. There's not just one reason to create a club, but collegia in particular, that are artisans, had originally been organized, at least according to myth, by the second king of Rome named Numa Pompilius. And so we know that these trade groups, these collegia, existed all the way into the period of the Roman Republic and then into the Empire. And they were allowed to form, but at various times when there are threats of populism and threats of rioting, like, for instance, under the Catilinarian conspiracy in the 1st century BCE, or under a man named Clodius, also in the 1st century BCE, they use collegia as supporters to vote for them and to support them. And that is a threat to the Senate. And so legislation from about 64 BCE onward, every few years, we have the disbanding of all collegia within Rome and oftentimes the Italic Peninsula, because collegia are very much seen as a threat and supporters of populist tactics rather than the traditional, what we would say, patrician or optimates that predominate. And probably the most famous one of these is Cicero. Cicero hates collegia, and he feels very threatened by them. And so at various times when these collegia get together and have a strong representation, they're disbanded by legislation that calls them treasonous or calls them against the Roman Republic, right? And this is something that we see in the Industrial Revolution, but it's also something that we see especially in anti-union cartoons and anti-union rhetoric at the beginning of the 20th century. You call unions anti-American, and that's the way that you justify disbanding them. And Romans did that first.
So that's super interesting. And what is the collegium the fundamental tool of the labor organizing, or is it merely the first layer? I mean, like, so when somebody calls a strike, what's the unit that's calling the strike?
These are all great questions, and depending on where you are, this is going to differ. And so let's talk about the Bible. Let's talk about a type of collective action that we see that is very familiar to especially those who have read the New Testament. If you look to the book of Acts, you know that in what we think is around the 50s CE, Paul and two, if not more, of his followers go to Ephesus. Okay, Ephesus has a gigantic temple of Artemis, and the major collegium that runs this union shop here, it's kind of like Pittsburgh when you go to Ephesus, is the silversmiths. Okay, the silversmiths, they sell tchotchkes that are resold around the area of the Temple of Artemis for pilgrims. It's a pilgrim.
That's still true, by the way. There's an amazing sign outside of the old city of Ephesus which says "real fake watches," and it is the best tchotchke shop I have ever been to. Just for that sign, the tradition continues.
Yes, and this idea of souvenir economies is someone that's studying this right now is a wonderful historian named Maggie Popkin, and she has a book just on Roman souvenirs that I adore. But Ephesus is a huge souvenir economy, and so when Paul comes, he is rabble-rousing to their mind because he's telling people, don't buy these idols. That's blasphemous. Follow these new Christ followers. Follow me as the Apostle Paul, and reject buying of all silver idols that are to Artemis, because that is a false god. And the silversmiths are like, what the fuck, Paul? Like, what are you doing? And so they chase.
I mean, help me with the silversmiths here. This guy wanders in. You got a Artemis god who's protected the city. And I just want to point out that Ephesus follows Paul, goes Christian, and then the water, the source of the river, silts up the harbor. And within 3 centuries, the place is abandoned and it's 3 miles from the coast. So this does not work out well for the Ephesians. I just want to point out.
And the silversmiths have this very powerful, as you say, underlying organization and structure. So if we think of collegia as kind of a way of activating a skeleton within a community, right? They're kind of this skeleton within the community that can be activated when necessary. And so part of what I do is to gauge how quickly people can come together as a group. And the way that the silversmiths appear to call together all the other silversmiths and to have a scribe that is speaking for them. All of these Ephesians get together with the silversmiths in the theater at Ephesus, and they have chased two of Paul's followers. Paul, by the way, is a bit of a coward, and he goes into hiding. He's not there. So they all chase these two followers of Paul into the theater, and they start screaming at him to stop what they're doing, to stop telling people not to buy the silver. But how quickly people are coming together, I think, is indicative of the fact that these collegia have a very organized communication network that has been set up. And this is true within Rome under Clodius, when Clodius harangues and speaks especially to the tavern workers, the tabernarii, because a lot of these poor collegia are meeting in taverns, just like the early unions in the Industrial Revolution. That is one way to get unions out of bars, is to not allow alcohol and to not allow hot food to be served. And so we have a similar thing that is happening in the Roman world, is that they are activated predominantly through this network of memberships, that we have these people coming together in a way that I think can only be explained because collegia speak to each other very quickly.
Ev?
Well, I was wondering, do we have like in every collegia one leader that is pushing the idea, like really, or do you see it more like it's more of like instinctive and like everyone kind of agrees, but you like, do you have strong leadership figures and do?
Yeah. So I think, again, every collegium is different. Not all of them engage in strikes. Some of them just get together and like to worship Bacchus and get drunk, which, more power to you.
Totally legit.
Totally legit. Get together and have your wine club. I love that for you. Although the Bacchus collegia are outlawed after a very raucous engagement in the city of Rome, and there is a law that is disseminated in 186 BCE because the Bacchic cult worshippers do get out of hand at night.
I mean, they don't. The word bacchanalian didn't make it down to our time for
but that's
nothing.
Technically anti-assembly legislation. So we have that example. But all collegia are like snowflakes. They're all very unique. But we know from inscriptions, and we have many of them, that tell us that there is an internal hierarchy and a way for people to gain status within their, let's say, demimonde, or within their subculture, because they imitate the names of Roman magistrates within their collegium. So they have, what we might call a president, a vice president, secretaries, archivists, scribes, and all of these people are oftentimes elected within the collegium. And so even if you can't be a praetor, even if you can't be a consul, you don't have enough money to be a senator, maybe you can be the president of your Elks Club, or you can be the president of your local book club. And I think that that's the same for today, is that we all create communities wherein we can gain prestige on a micro level, even if we never have the money to be a senator.
It's so interesting because when we think of, like, if you think about ancient Rome in the more traditional Roman history sense, you have a sense that there's like the political leadership and this very complicated constitutional arrangement for selecting people. And then you have the religious cults and you have the army, and that's it, right? Like there's no, but what you're describing is a very elaborate civil society.
Exactly. And I think that is the beauty of history from below, that we didn't know about a lot of these collegia until around the end of the 19th century. We had a huge German publication that came out called the CIL, the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum. And this was thousands and thousands of inscriptions that were published by a man named Theodor Mommsen in Germany, because of course it was a meticulous German scholar that created this. And all of these inscriptions, some of them are for elite people, but many of them are just epitaphs for regular folks. And because Tacitus doesn't care at all about Calagia, and because Suetonius and Ammianus Marcellinus, they believe that privileging the elites is the way to write history, suddenly these thousands of inscriptions that were published changed the game. Social history was now the thing. And that combined with movements like the Bolshevik Rebellion, or, for instance, when Syme writes The Roman Revolution, it's during the beginning of World War II, people are beginning to become much more invested in understanding the people. The Senate had gotten a lot of attention for a long time, and now the Populusque, it was the time for the populace to have more representation. And Calagia appeared to be a way that people created identity in a world that overlooked them. And that includes enslaved persons and freed persons that are called liberti. Like, these persons are so heavily marginalized within society, but they can form Calagia.
Super, super interesting. All right, so let's now talk about the reaction, which you've described. Cicero, unsurprisingly, not so interested in the Collegia. What is why, as Rome becomes quite authoritarian at different points, why does this tradition survive?
Well, Julius Caesar sees a lot of problems with Calagia. And so when Julius Caesar comes to power, we think probably in 47 or 46. So we're talking 2 years after he crosses the Rubicon. Famously, he crosses the Rubicon on January 10th of 49 BCE. And the Rubicon is not a gigantic river, but he does cross it and thus declares war on Rome.
And just for those who don't know this, crossing the Rubicon is not a good thing. People use crossing the Rubicon, including Justice Anthony Kennedy, as though it just means doing something important or big. It means making war on your society, making war on the constitutional fabric of your society.
When you say alia iacta est, that means the die. People oftentimes think it means die, like you're dying a river or something. No, you're throwing the dice. You've cast the dice, and now whatever happens with those dice, you are responsible for it. And so he crosses it in arms. He keeps his troops together and he declares war. But one thing Julius Caesar doesn't do is that he doesn't kill his enemies the way that Sulla had with the proscriptions. So what he needs to do, to his mind, is to get rid of any kind of treason in other ways. And so we think around 47 or 46, he passes legislation on Calagia that tries to disband them within the city of Rome and other places. Now, whether Calagia actually listened to him is another issue that is very difficult to suss out, because just because you have legislation doesn't mean that people follow it. Like, I jaywalked this morning and that's against the law. So just because...
Yeah, we don't admit that anymore because, no. And when Sarah says she jaywalked, what she means is she scrupulously waited for the light to turn green, and then she walked within the crosswalk.
It was 6 a.m. and there are no cars out here at Iowa. So I took some liberties, but just because a law exists doesn't necessarily mean people follow it. And we know that this is true. All of us downloaded illegal music from Napster back in the day. Even if you don't admit it, many of us have engaged in things that are illegal. I always tell my students I'm about 89% law following. So 11% illegal in terms of my actions. And so it's the same thing for legislation in the past, is that what we can tell is that Julius Caesar did not like the Collegia. And so he tries to disband them, but then he gets killed only a few years later on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. So who takes up the mantle of anti-Collegia legislation? That's going to be Octavian Augustus. And so Octavian then passes legislation that says that the only Collegia that can exist are if they are old, like Jews. Collegia of Jews get a special dispensation because they are antiqua. But
this is before Hadrian.
Oh yes, absolutely. So we have Antiqua Collegia, like the Jews in Alexandria or Judea and Palestine. They get a special dispensation, but those who are utilitas, that have utilitas, that is to say utility to the republic, they're allowed to exist. So let's say construction workers, they're allowed to exist, and various collegia that he sees as specifically contributing to the republic.
So you want just enough civil society to be that you can call upon to be useful, but you don't want enough to be an organized basis for any ferment.
Exactly. And you want to use patronage as an emperor in a very strategic way to keep them docile. And so what Augustus oftentimes does is specifically patronize collegia that he does not want to rise up, just like we talked about with the veterans. And this is going to be the same for many different emperors thereafter, is that the first step to dealing with discord will always be, or oftentimes be, dispelling all the collegia first. So there's a riot in 59 in Pompeii. And the first thing Nero does when there's a riot is he goes, no collegia in Pompeii, disband them, get rid of them. And so what we're starting to see is the formation of the use of this anti-collegia legislation as a way of saying, look, any kind of threat of adversity, discord, or pushing back against the empire, we will disband all your collegia, so don't even try it. And Pompeii is one example, but there are many other towns that are not allowed to have collegia or assemblies when they engage in what we call mobbing or rioting, etc. And so I have to admit that part of my interest in this is like when you call someone a mob or a riot, that is very pejorative rhetoric. And it's a way of justifying disbandment altogether, is to call somebody a mob.
And that's old.
Very old. So Cicero calls them a multitudo, right? That you have got these vulgar people that are coming together to riot. And he says, look, we have to keep peace. We have to keep order. Law and order comes before anything else in society. So the good of the many has to be before the good of the singular person. And Cicero is the first one to say that utility justifies existence. And so if you don't have any utility in society, what good are you?
Yeah, fast forward 2025. If we learn from that, where do we land? What can we expect from what we've learned in history?
I mean, I've gone to the University of Chicago and seen the large encampments, especially that we had in April and May, especially of 2024. I went and spoke with a lot of the supporters of Palestine who were encamped at the University of Chicago. I spoke to the ones here at the University of Iowa. My co-editor, Stephanie Wong, went and spoke with various ones at the University of Michigan. And it's so disheartening to see administrators at places like Columbia using the same rhetoric of, oh, they're gonna engage in violence. These are peaceful protesters for the most part. And so I think recognizing that trying to get rid of assemblies, whether they're peaceful, is the biggest metric. And we have very little violence that we have seen from any of the pro-Palestinian protesters. And so to me, I'm seeing a lot of very sad similarities, is that you disband people and pass anti-assembly legislation, and then just say that, oh well, they're causing discord, and we need law and order on this campus, and it's something that is sadly relevant. I didn't know how relevant it was going to be when I started writing this in 2020. So yes.
So I'm curious, as you so the book is not out yet, is that right?
February
It's out in
4th,
February?
and we have a book launch in Philadelphia for the large conference that we have of ancient historian nerds, but then it officially comes out February 4th. Yeah.
Well, I hope you will, first of all, before I forget to say, come back and talk about after I've had a chance to read it, so that we can actually have a conversation that's a little bit more about the book. Although this has been pretty about the book, I think. I'm curious. There's a hybrid quality of this book, which is kind of about inspired by, as you describe, modern labor disputes. Um, but it is, of course, a work of Roman history. Also has a dialogue with the labor history movement, which doesn't tend to think about Rome at all, and really, begins with feudalism and the Industrial Revolution. So if I put on my Marxist theory hat, I would say if Karl Marx were here, he would bark at you in some rough German. But these collegia that you're talking about, these people in ancient Rome, they didn't have class consciousness. And what distinguishes a modern labor movement is thinking about class as class and getting rid of this whole SPQR nonsense, right? And the working movement of ancient Rome is a bunch of little collegia. It's not a class conscious with a vanguard party that represents them. And so, okay, Marx is in the other frame here, and he says that to you, and there's a dismissive quality, right? Because laced throughout his work is that, this idea that history is inevitable, but we have to build this, and this is something about now. And so what do you say to him? Is he right, or is he basically selling the collegia short?
I think that he is right that there is no class consciousness. This has been a huge debate by major economists like Walter Scheidel at Stanford, who's the head of classics at Stanford, and read this book, and it was terrifying to have him read it. But we have all of the major new institutional economists oftentimes working on collegia right now. And so you would be exactly right to say that there's no class consciousness. But what is most important is to say that the medieval guild was not the progenitor of the modern day labor union. That collegia need to be recognized as part of a growth and understanding of the power of collective action, that we need to go back further. So I'm not saying that the medieval guilds shouldn't be studied, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't look at modern unions as well, but we need to be included in the narrative. And to write collegia out and to exclude Roman historians and Egyptian historians, for instance, from the period of the New Kingdom, for instance, to include those ancient historians in the current conversations that we're having about labor will create much more continuity and understanding that these tactics have existed for a long time, and that is because they are effective. And so I guess what I'm saying is the level of and the frequency of strikes was not the same frequency we have today, and there was not a class consciousness, but having a broader understanding and including historians from pre-modernity is a way that we can come together to make the labor movement stronger. I think we are stronger together. And that doesn't go just for unions, it goes for historians also working together for the future rather than just arguing about who was the first to do X or who was the first to do Y. That's not as important as it is saying we all bring something to the table and we can all move forward by understanding that these tactics and the retaliatory legislation that comes with it is a very old game.
Super, super interesting. Last question, unless Ev has one afterwards. How should we understand Spartacus? I mean, he does have the advantage of looking exactly like Kirk Douglas. He's he has the great line, "I am Spartacus," or he doesn't say it, of course, but everybody else does. How do we understand him in this history?
Well, I think a very important thing to understand about all three servile wars, because Spartacus is the last of the third. So the third servile war we also call the Spartacan War from 73 to 71 BCE. It starts with familiae getting kitchen utensils from the gladiatorial kitchen in the camps. So how it starts is that you have troops that are in itself forced groups, right? These gladiatorial troops, they work together, they live together, and they function together. They work in tandem. And so these familiae of gladiators are the ones that start the rebellion. So if you want to see the underlying structure of the Spartacan War, you have to say that it starts at the troop level, that the troops work in tandem just like legions or cohorts would, or like unions would, in order to start the rebellion in 73 in the kitchen there in Capua. So we have a lot of evidence that people working together in groups have great power. And I think that Spartacus wants to attain freedom, and that when they got close to the Alps, they should have just kept going, but they circle back and they come down into the Italic Peninsula again. But the ultimate goal of Spartacus and his perhaps as many as 100,000 enslaved persons and various people that are following him, that they simply want to have agency and recognition and freedom. But a lot of the workers in my book are individuals who are simply looking to improve their lot in life rather than to gain full autonomy and freedom, that they're trying to work together in order to improve their lives.
We are going to leave it there. Sarah Bond, you are a great American. It is so great to have you on the show again in its new incarnation. Hey, folks in the Greek chorus, I am humbly suggesting that you consider a name change of the Great Greek chorus to the Collegium, since the implication of Greek chorus is that you intone things together, whereas in fact you are a cacophonous civil society assemblage of interesting folks who comes together in an assembly every morning. So I'm just, look, the Greek chorus is its own autonomous domain. It's like it has the tribune of the plebs, and I don't order it around, but I do ask you to consider whether you are really more of a collegium than a chorus. Let's do this again soon, Sarah.
Well, I'm going to send you guys
fun.
copies of the book. Yale Press has already approved that. So, you get a book, you get a book, you get a book. Yeah.
Well, I am very excited to read this book. As I say, I have one child who is a labor movement organizer. I have another child who is a Roman historian, and this brings together so many features of my own life and interests. So I'm super excited about it. Folks, we're going to be back tomorrow with President Tomas Ilves of Estonia, former president, friend of the show, enemy of Vladimir Putin, great American, and keep the faith. And Sarah, congratulations on the book, which is available. I checked for pre-sale, so order it. And
it will be on Audible. They're recording the audiobook right now, not with my Minnie Mouse voice, but with a different voice. So
I think your Minnie Mouse voice talking about labor actions would have been fabulous. So I'm all right, folks. We'll see you tomorrow.
thank you.